a Sins at Boston Avenue podcast. My name is Philip Boone, and I use he, him, his pronouns.
And I'm Caitlin Drake. I use female pronouns she, her, hers.
Before we begin, I'd like to state that the views represented in this podcast are those of the individuals in this conversation and not the official position of Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. This podcast series has been recorded remotely from our individual homes during the COVID-19 pandemic as we practice physical distancing as a church community. This is the fifth and final episode in our Christianity and Pop Culture series where we discuss how Christianity and pop culture intersects. Our guest for the series is Reverend Sara Pugh Montgomery. Welcome, Sarah.
Hey, y'all.
Okay, Sarah, so today's episode is focusing on Christianity and art. And when we talked about doing the series early on, we knew that different flavors of Christianity offer different theologies, sometimes that are in conflict with popular culture, and yet faith and culture are so deeply intertwined, and art has stood out as a particularly strong example of culture and faith overlapping. Some of our greatest cultural artistic touch points are that intersection of church and culture. So we think about great Renaissance art, for example. So can you talk a little bit about the church's historical relationship to art?
Absolutely. So this won't be a huge history lesson because I don't know how far back we want to go. But I think one of the really fascinating pieces to think about with art and with religion and faith is that for so long, reading was not a way that folks actually were able to understand the Bible because many folks could not initially read. And so you kind of can think back, if we think of art in all of its forms, the ways that we've talked about it, initially folks kind of used storytelling as an art to be able to pass on the biblical narratives. We then had music as a way, so songs as a way to be able to learn more about who God is and to be able to sing about that. So again, people who couldn't read could still sing together. And then you kind of go into the, dance was used a lot to be able to express your gratitude and love to God and to have things to celebrate. And then you kind of go into these pieces of art that is more of a visual art piece. And so, kind of within our biblical narrative, you might think about the Ark of the Covenant was kind of that perhaps this symbol of a piece of art. If you know Indiana Jones, you have it in your head right now. You're thinking about what the ark looked like. But there's this idea then of this visual piece of a way to be able to represent God and to kind of be able to show and to have something that we could be able to look at. Many folks who, for instance, that think about at their burials, they want to have a place for their family to be able to go to be able to remember. And so that there's this image and this piece that's able to bring up that story and that narrative. And so for us, it kind of begins with that image of the ark and then is able to continue as we kind of built temples, as the Jewish faith was able to kind of gather at a temple spaces, that there were visualizations of who God is and was and how God was in relationship with us. And during the Renaissance time, and especially in the European churches with the grand cathedrals, all of the stained glass windows were able to tell the stories of the Bible. And so if you, again, couldn't read, you could still go into a church and be able to, read with your eyes the story of the scripture and narrative. And so to be able to have art as a way of helping us be able to continue to learn more about who God is, the stories of God, and to kind of be able to wrap that into something that that isn't limited to folks who are just able to read. And so that visual sense. So unfortunately, it doesn't work for folks who are visually impaired, but with the visual sense of being able to relate to things. So even a child could be able to come in and kind of, my daughter can still look at things and see a visual representation of Jesus and can kind of talk a little bit about about who Jesus is within that. So you're able to kind of bring in historically that image and those imagings of God, of Jesus, of the church, of the different stories and the narratives throughout Scripture.
We're going to move into talking about a few important historic art pieces, starting with the Pieta. What can you tell us about the Pieta?
Oh man, this is a beautiful work of art. So this podcast, we do encourage you to, if you're listening to it while you're driving, to just kind of take note, because you're going to want to go home and to look at these pieces of art, kind of to reflect on it on your own as well. So the Pieta is a stone piece of art. So it's a carving that Michelangelo did, and it's in the Vatican City. So it's in St. Peter's Basilica, and it's located there as a way of being able to reflect. It's a reflection of Christ, and but more importantly, within the reflection is Mary. And so Mary's grief after her son, Christ, was on the cross. And so she is holding her grieving, or she is grieving as she is holding her child. And so Pieta in Italian means pity or mercy or compassion. And so you kind of have this image of compassion, of Mary holding her son and being able to embrace her son after his death. It was a piece of sculpture that was, kind of created around the 18th century, and was a piece that was really reflective of that Renaissance time frame, and that time frame of being able to reflect on Mary, and especially for the Catholic Church, that really kind of upholds Mary in a in a different and unique way than many Protestant churches, that it was able to really look at what Mary experienced through that death. And so you have this just breathtaking and oftentimes shocking view of what Mary would have looked like as she was holding her child that had just died.
Is this an art piece that you've viewed in person, Sarah?
Yes. So I went to Italy when I was in seminary, and traveled around with some of my friends. And so we went to Vatican City on a Sunday, and so got to see the Pope come out and wave at us from the window, and were able to do that, and then went into St. Peter's Basilica. And it was actually kind of funny, because I'm one of those travelers that, I do read the books and kind of get myself prepared, but sometimes I forget what I'm about to experience. And so I kind of went in and was kind of taken back, because I was like, oh yeah, I forgot this piece was in this building. Like it's in, this church. And so it's, right as you enter in, it's to your right side, right at the front. And it's kind of off to the side a little bit and in a little alcove. And it's the only thing that's there. And so, kind of being able to go over on the day that we were there, it wasn't very busy. And so we were able to go over and, just kind of sit and look and reflect, and to, imagine what it would be like to, to have to hold your child, and what that grief looks like, and what that grief was being experienced as. I went with a friend of mine that he and I had just finished up our clinical pastoral education together, which is a chaplaincy work in a hospital setting. So kind of having gone through a bunch of work around grief, to then sit in front of an image of, of really extreme grief, just was very moving for the two of us to be able to experience that together, after we'd had a whole summer of grieving together at the loss of many patients and many circumstances that we experienced at the hospital. So it was a very, a piece of art that really touched me personally, and also connected to pieces of faith and pieces of grief that I was also struggling with at the time.
Another historical art piece that we thought we'd talk about are the different images of Magnificat at the Church of the Annunciation in Bethlehem. Tell us a little bit about this art and what makes it significant through the lens of faith.
Yeah, this is another wonderful piece about Mary. And so perhaps I'm a little bit more Catholic leaning than I thought I was, because I love these Mary pieces. And so the Magnificat is the time, and so there's this church where the folks believe at the Church of the Annunciation, where it is presumed or believed or kind of traditionally held that this is the spot where the angels came and one angel came and was able to tell Mary that, like, hey, you're preggers, and by the way, you're pregnant with the Messiah. And so, kind of a very significant space within the Christian faith, and a space that was a huge space of transformation for Mary. And so there is a church there that is decorated all on the outside with different murals and paintings of people's interpretation and of different countries' interpretation of this visitation. And so the beautiful thing about this, kind of when you're going into this church, and you have to stand outside for a while usually because you're waiting to be able to go inside, you're able to look around and to see all of these different ways that Mary is portrayed based on the different ethnicities and different cultures of different spaces. And so, for many of us, we probably, again, kind of the way that we think of when we are portraying Jesus or Mary or the Holy Family, in many of our churches, we think of, we often see the image of Jesus as, a white person with brown hair and blue eyes. But in this reflection of Mary, you see the image of Mary in each one of the different cultures. So Mary, the Magnificat, as portrayed from the Philippines, has a Filipino Mary. And the Magnificat, as portrayed from, Brazil, has a Brazilian Mary and has a lot more kind of colors and flavor around it. Mary from Nigeria is a Black woman. And so that there's this beauty in being able to think about something that was so particular, so something that happened to one family and to one person within a specific place in a specific time, is able to be reflected in the images around the world in many different ways. And, how we're kind of able to be able to all relate to a same narrative, but in a different manner. And for many ways, I love that, because it really kind of brings together what we've been talking about the whole time during this series, is about the many different ways that our Christian faith can be represented, that it's not just this one way of looking at just the Bible, for instance, but that, movies and TV and music and musicals can all help enhance and teach us about our faith. And so when I saw all of these different images of Mary and the different images of the Magnificat, it really kind of brought home that idea that, it's not just the way that I view or the way that I describe this, but instead this is more of a universal and a global piece, and that there's many different ways that could be communicated to different folks. And so I just loved the way that was done outside of a church in the middle of Bethlehem. And so that's not often something that you see, kind of all of those different representations of the images of the Holy Family in those different manners. And so it really kind of brought all of that home for me, and was I think a wonderful use of art to be able to represent the diversity and the uniqueness of culture in the midst of a story that everybody knows and that everybody can relate to.
So moving to more modern art and artists, I know that you've used John August Swanson in some of the Sunday school courses that you've taught. And so I know that he's an artist that you have an affinity for. So I'd love to talk a little bit more about him and his art. Can you tell me a little bit about him, or tell us a little bit about him?
Yeah, so John August Swanson, I actually didn't know a ton about him until seminary. And so he was an artist that my seminary had picked up as we were redoing our whole building, that then they ended up kind of bringing in all of his artwork and having it was hung all over the different spaces of our building. And it's actually the most extensive collection of his artwork. So that's at the Candler School of Theology in Atlanta, and has over 55 works of his art hung up. And so he is a artist that is, kind of uses not so much the artwork that we've already been talking about. So in terms of stone or normal things like oil and pieces like that, but he paints in some oil and watercolor and acrylic and mixed media, but he really kind of looks a lot more at a way of art called serigraphs and lithographs and etchings. And so he kind of works in a different sort of medium. I think something that's really beautiful and unique about his work is that he is really an artist who is about creating a story and a narrative within his art. And so he comes from a background with a Mexican mother and a Swedish father. And so kind of bringing in those two different cultural pieces enhances the way that his art really is about telling a story and telling a narrative. And so he really wants to look at the human values and the cultural roots and his own quest for sort of self-discovery through visual images. And so he looks a lot at a biblical story and then just depicts what he thinks that biblical narrative would look like if you were telling a story about it. So it isn't just like a straight on view of a person, but instead is a image of a whole narrative and a whole piece of art together.
What is an iconic piece of art by this particular artist?
So a lot of his pieces, again, are pieces that are about the scripture and the different pieces of narrative around that. One of his great pieces is called The Visitation. So just like we've been talking about with Mary and being able to be told then that she was going to have baby Jesus. And that piece that he has called the Visitation is what it's called. And kind of when you're looking at it, when I taught it in a class, it was also a kind of find all of the different scriptures that are a part of this piece of art. And so kind of like, if you grew up doing the Where's Waldo books, then you were always looking for Waldo and kind of looking around, but then you were looking for all the other different things that were hidden within that piece. And that's really what he does within this piece, is to be able to have the different narratives that are hidden throughout the so a woman's cloak has different images of creation. There's at the top of a roof is an image of pieces of the flood narrative. And so that you kind of see how then within this art that he takes how all that was happening throughout the biblical story is now coming together in this one piece of Mary being told that she was going to give birth to the Messiah. So kind of all of these pieces are all related to what is happening within this piece of art. And so it's this wonderful piece of that. My other favorite piece of his is called The Festival of Lights, just because it's a great piece that looks at the ways that that all of the people can kind of come together and how they're a part of lifting up and bringing together those lights.
Sara, the C in Ascends of our core values stands for cultivates music, architecture, and the arts as a means of experiencing God. Would you be able to talk a little bit about how that is reflected in the building of Boston Avenue?
Yeah, I think that our building is such a unique piece of who we are as a church. When I was coming to Oklahoma, I got a travel guide about Oklahoma. And our church was in the travel guide because of being able to come and to see the building. And I was like, holy cow, like that's crazy. And then eventually I got appointed here. So that was even crazier to be appointed to a church that's in a travel guide. But what the travel guide kind of talked about, and I think the reason why our building is so unique in that manner, is the whole theme around the Art Deco and how unique that building is, rather than it being kind of what we were talking about before with the stained glass windows telling stories. That is a very Gothic style and a very Renaissance style. Whereas in our building, the stained glass doesn't really tell you a story as much as it invites you into thinking about a story. And so invites you into reflecting and kind of using your own sense of faith and personal reflection. So that, Philip, you might look at a piece of stained glass in our church and think of something completely different than what I might think about, because it's not as much of a, here's the narrative that we want to tell you. It's more of an invitation into being a part of God's overall narrative. Same thing with they call them the broken arches. So kind of the, pieces that are pointing up kind of in an arrow, is all about directing us up to God and being able to direct us to prayer with God. And then the the prayer hands at the very top. So if you've never seen it, you can kind of look now that we have like little prayer hands all around the top of the main sanctuary. So it's up at the top, kind of on the outside of the main sanctuary piece. And again, it's directing us to being able to be in relationship with God. So I think that our building is so unique within that there is a piece of more of an invitation, perhaps, rather than a telling of a certain narrative, minus the 2 mosaics that are in our central hall, and kind of being able to have the mosaics that are more about telling us a story, rather than the rest of the church is really an architecture that is inviting us into being in conversation with God and inviting us into a faith narrative of our own.
Something that I think is interesting about our building is we know that a lot of churches are struggling to keep their buildings, and especially during this time when it's not safe to gather in a building. We know our relationship with physical buildings is changing. We, as in this kind of bigger sense of Christianity or the movement that is church. So I kind of wonder what your thoughts or reflections are on that are. Is our building insignificant now?
That's a great question. There's and I think it's weird coming from my perspective, because my perspective is a perspective that has I don't have necessarily, because of how often I move, I don't really have any spaces that I could say like, oh, this is my sacred home necessarily. I've lived in 9 different states, and within those 9 different states have had even different places of faith that I would call my church homes within those different spaces. And so I have a kind of a different perspective on buildings and on kind of the sacredness of buildings. But I also really see the reflection piece that many folks have in terms of a connection to the experiences that they have had within a particular space. And so the connection that they have to a particular building that is about their faith formation in a lot of ways. It's maybe not necessarily, something that they have to be within that space in order to be able to have that experience, but maybe it's more of a memory piece, kind of this idea of remembering. And, the whole idea then, if we kind of bring back the narrative of the ark, that the ark was about us being able to remember. And, God gave us the sign of the rainbow to remember. And so some of those pieces are things that we can carry with us. And the ark you physically carried with you because they were a nomadic group. But now we are a much more kind of grounded group where people kind of have their roots within a space. and then they form around that space and around those roots and that formation. And so I think that having buildings is very helpful with that then, because then you're able to have a space where people can gather, where people can kind of have that sense of community, where they can have those marks of their own faith journey and their experiences within a particular space. But I think what gets hard and challenging is when we think that faith can only happen within that particular space. So I think there's a difference between being able to remember and to give thanks and to honor. You know, I was married at the prayer chapel, which is at the very top of the tower of Boston Avenue. So there is actually part of the building that I do hold as sacred space. But I don't think my marriage is that, you know, if something happened to our tower and that chapel was gone, I wouldn't think that my marriage was going to disappear. At least I hope not, because that would be weird if my marriage was that tied to a building. So I think that there is kind of a push, a pull and a tug around being able to have a space that is a grounding within our own faith formation versus how do we kind of separate our faith formation from having to be within a particular space. And so that it's good to honor and to remember the things that have happened within those sacred spaces, but then to also ask ourselves, how am I experiencing God within all these other sacred spaces? So I do think we're in a weird kind of transition piece for that. You know, even during this time of COVID and of our building being closed, like I know of families that came and, you know, they got all dressed up on Easter Sunday and they literally came to the church, even though it was closed, and took pictures in front of the azaleas, because that's what they've done every other Easter. And they just needed that connection to the building and to that space. You know, I know Caitlin and Alicia, y'all had senior portraits that you were able to do with folks at the building, you know, on the steps. We weren't able to go inside still, but kind of there still is a connection to a space. So I kind of think that for us, the question is kind of as we move forward, how do we continue to honor the sacredness of a space, but then open ourselves up to how can we experience God in new spaces as well and in new places? Because I think it's going to be a both and. Sort of moving into a different phase of faith and a different phase of being church.
And I think, you know, we're in that transition, and we're in a space, I think particularly right now, where our relationship with the building does look very different. So one of the things we've been doing on our social media is having a building photo of the day. And as the person who manages our social media, I've tried to tie those photos to some of the artistic underpinnings of those. So when we have, you know, a photo of our broken arches, you know, what does that symbolize, and how do we take that reflection of that symbolism into a place where, you know, we're not physically present with that symbol. And so
well, and I think something that you did really early on, which I think was great, was to also be able to have a piece of the building that folks could carry into their own home spaces. So, you know, you were even able to see, like, this building holds special meaning and sacredness for folks, but we're in different spaces now. So how do we kind of do the both and at the same time? And so I think that there was a lot of, you know, of good forward thinking that you did with that, and kind of being able to suggest that, because, you know, there is a beauty within that building for sure. And so, but there's also beauty within all of God's creation. So kind of how can we mix the two together and be able to hold the sacredness of a space along with the beauty of all that God has created?
I find this to be an interesting conversation because I've grown up going to numerous churches throughout my life, and I don't think I have felt that way about any of the past churches I've gone to. Obviously it's a sacred space, but not like if we were outside of the building. I don't find myself thinking about missing particular parts of the building that often. I never felt that particular way. And one thing about Boston Avenue is it's a historical building. So I feel like that's a little bit different than some of the others I've been a part of. And then the Art Deco, the architecture is different than other churches as well. And also one thing about Boston Avenue is there are 4th, 5th, 6th generations that grow up going to Boston Avenue, which a lot of churches do have. But I feel like Boston Avenue actually there are a lot of more than 1 or 2 generations that have gone through Boston Avenue, more than churches I think I've been a part of. So I wonder if just that also has an impact on how you feel about that space as well.
Yeah, I think we're many things. So we're not just a church or a church community or a church building. We are a historic site. Our building is on the National Register for Historic Places. And it was intentionally constructed as an art piece. The Ada Robinson, who designed the building, was an artist and an art instructor. And so there is that multiple layers of not just a church building, that, maybe some other churches were constructed more along the lines of how do we gather together, whereas this building was maybe had the lens of how do we cultivate space for God. So I think that, that's part of this conversation around art too.
Oh,
and
absolutely.
Our personal relationship with it as a church community.
Yeah. I mean, I think exactly the uniqueness of the stained glass, I think, is the exact thing that you're talking about, because it's not most churches, their stained glass has images on it and is telling the stories, is Jesus with some lambs, or, there's lots of, but our stained glass, I mean, there's nothing that's like, okay, this is the story of creation, or this is the story of Noah and the ark, or this is this disciple, So I think you're totally right, Caitlin, in that there is a difference within our own building that is unique to who we are, because it was created as art, and that this art was more of an invitation rather than here's the story to tell, from this. And so that's, it's tricky then, because then it really is this tricky piece of, what does this mean for us as people of faith and as, people of Boston Avenue?
So because it's my favorite part of any podcast, but particularly this podcast series, I want to talk a little bit about controversy.
Controversy. Let's get into it.
I know you're super surprised that I want to talk about it. So kind of tracing it back, I guess the kind of earliest controversy that I thought was fascinating while I was doing some research for this. There are some historians who look at the Catholic Church making a huge investment in art during the Renaissance period. So like the Sistine Chapel, that was hecka expensive, go figure. And so the Catholic Church was spending all of this money patronizing the arts, creating these huge buildings and sculptures and paintings. And that was driving a bunch of need for funds from the Catholic Church. So they were doing lots of things to make money as a church, and that was part of what drove the Protestant Reformation. So the relationship between the church and art was actually part of how we got to where we are as a Christian community with these different expressions and denominations. So I think that that's just like wild. And I didn't know if you had heard about that at all, Sarah. Like, I don't know that they talk about the Catholic Church spending a lot of money on art in seminary or not. You tell me.
Well, they do talk about it a little bit, which is mainly just kind of looking at the ways that it kind of is looking at the controversies of the church historically. And that is one of the controversies, and again, like even when I visit these, chapels, I think I was in France with one of the chapels that kind of has all the different, it's just beautiful, beautiful stained glass, and everything is bronze and all these, or everything is gold and all these pieces and stuff. And there was, the movement that went against that then was the movement towards simplicity. Because people said, like, are we really honoring God, or are we just trying to have basically the most bling? Kind of what's what is the balance within this? Like, people felt like that there was too much spent on images and on the pieces of art rather than being spent on feeding the hungry and the poor. And so it really is this balance piece that comes up a lot. And yeah, I mean, the Catholic Church had a huge controversy and debate around that, and about like really what it meant to be church then. Kind of is sort of like what we were just talking about. Is church just art? Or is church about, being able to meet folks that were hungry? And that was kind of their either or piece. So they weren't able to really see the meld and the mesh of how it could be both necessarily. But it's probably because I think at that point, the Catholic Church was so focused on this piece of being art that it was a lot harder to see how both pieces were being portrayed within that sense. So yeah, I mean, it's a hard debate, and you still have those debates today. If you kind of always have that sort of joke that within a church you'll have the biggest debate around, or controversy around, kind of what carpet color should be in the sanctuary, and so it's still, and how much money we should be spending on those things. And so it still is a really hard and, debated topic. Like when my church in Virginia, when we were going through thinking about repairing and replacing our organ, which was a $1 million project, it took us a year and a half to be able to talk to our congregation and to really get them on board with that. Because it was more about it being an instrument of art. And they were like, well, but what about all the hungry people in Winchester? And how many people could we feed for $1 million? And so it was so yeah, that is a huge controversy that still continues to this day. And I think is a piece of hard debate, and a piece of being able to try to figure out how do we look at both and, in a sense, and kind of balance, rather than thinking in the either or kind of polarities.
I think another kind of modern controversy is when art pushes outside the bounds of our comfort, around faith. So our Barton Clinton Gordy lecturer brought up Christa, which was a sculpture, a bronze sculpture of a female Christ, and the outrage and the backlash 30 years ago when that was hanging, and just what that says about our own relationship to Christ, and kind of this expectation that we have of what it should look like. So and then kind of another kind of even pushing that boundary further, the National Endowment for the Arts, there's been an ongoing debate about whether that should be funded or not for 30 plus years. And one of the pieces that really triggered the initial controversy around NEA funding was called Piss Christ. Sorry, that's what it's titled. And the artist, he identifies as a practicing Catholic. So he was kind of hoping people would reflect on commercialism of religion and parts that make us uncomfortable. And there was a huge conservative Christian backlash to funding works like that make a mockery, I'm using air quotes, of Christ or of religion. So I wonder, as a pastor, Sarah, should our faith be threatened by any kind of art? Are there forbidden things? Are there sacred cows when it comes to art and faith? How or should we take those opportunities to push boundaries?
Yeah, that's it also reminds me of one of the movies we were thinking about talking about was the movie Dogma. And that was, but we couldn't easily access it. So it wasn't something we wanted to talk about in case folks hadn't seen it. But one of the pieces kind of around that was this image of a buddy Christ. And so of Jesus kind of as your big old pal and sort of giving you the thumbs up and pointing at you. And so I think there is, this idea of again, what it looks like in terms of about what is challenging to our faith in a sense. So is it the image of Christ as a female that could be challenging? And then if it is, why? Why is that challenging? Is it kind of having a defined image of who God is? Is that challenging? And if that is, then why is that challenging? I think that what I love about these different controversial pieces of art, there was another controversial piece of Jesus as a homeless person, and a church kind of had a statue of Christ as homeless that was on a bench sleeping and had it outside of the church. And it really kind of made folks think then in a different way about how are they serving the least among them. So for me, I think it's always important that when these controversial pieces come up and when something perhaps for me kind of hits me in a different way and I'm like, whoa, hold the phone. Like, why are we doing this? Then it's more of a question of, okay, why did that impact me? Like, what about my faith is truly being challenged within this? And is this a challenge really of faith, or is this a challenge of my image of faith? And that's why I loved that at the Church of the Magnificat, having all of those different images of Mary, because that could have been challenging for a lot of folks to see all of those different images of Mary instead of it being the Mary that, U.S. American would kind of think of what Mary would look like. So I think that I personally like the pushing of the boundaries within art and with our faith, because I think it allows me to ask some more questions about why would that be a piece that I would resist? Why is that a piece that I would say no towards? And maybe sometimes it's because it really is maybe it's not about honoring God. So maybe it's an image that really is degenerating, God. But if it's an image that's more about challenging my own personal beliefs or images or views of who I believe God to be in the world, then I think that's a good challenge for me to have, and probably a good challenge for all of us, because usually within those pieces, I'm able to better define my own faith and my own image of God, rather than just being able to say, oh, this is who I think God is, and that's the end of the story. Because within those pieces, I'm able to discern a bit more about why I would say that, and what is complicating that. So I kind of like the controversies. I love the piece that you talked about with the Christa. I think that there are pieces that are good about pushing us outside of our own boundaries, and I like that.
And I think something that I would just add, for the pieces that maybe do seem to denigrate God or faith or religion, I think a lot of that says more about how people have been hurt by Christianity, and how they're grappling with that than it really is. I think art like that often comes from pain, or from struggle, and so rather than kind of getting up in arms around faith, asking those questions around what would provoke that, I think maybe can help us get deeper. Just as somebody who knows people who have a really bad relationship with church, and who have sometimes used artistic means to express that, I think that's around a relationship with church and Christians that hasn't always been positive.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's a really great point to lift up, because I think that goes back again to the, what is the narrative and the other pieces behind the art that I need to know about? What are the, because there usually is, for every piece of art, there's a story. And it's not just a so for the Pieta, I'm sure that there was a story that Michelangelo had around grief. Otherwise, he couldn't have portrayed grief quite as well as he did. And so, that yes, there is this story that all of us know about, that is a common faith story, a common story of our own groundedness, but that there's also probably a personal story that was around, that was behind that piece of art. So I think that's a wonderful point to bring up, that again, it makes me then pause and ask the questions of, why is this challenging to me? And so I think that that's the biggest thing for us to be asking, is the why is this a challenge of my faith? Why does it matter to me in particular?
Sara, what is your favorite piece of religious art?
Oh, I probably don't have like an actual like favorite piece of religious art. Art's probably of the mediums that we have talked about, it's probably the one that I have the least knowledge around. But I kind of love a artist that is in Virginia. She is a ordained pastor, and her name is Suzanne Vinson. And I love the ways that she depicts different scriptures and different pieces, and kind of pulls me in with words. And so I kind of like art that really plays with words and images at the same time. It's probably why I like, August Swanson a lot, is because there's a multiplicity of images that are there, and kind of a storytelling piece. So I really love Suzanne Vinson, and the way that she is able to pull me in with her artwork, in terms of looking at it as a way to describe faith with words and colors. And so it's not just like a picture on that I might have up, but instead it's kind of using all these different images that really kind of pull me in. So she's who I like a lot.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you have anything else you'd like to discuss to either this discussion or any of our past discussions about pop culture and Christianity?
Now, just to say, like, this has been a wonderful podcast series, and I think a great way for us to explore how faith is can be a part of the pop culture. And so I would invite folks to be able to even tell us sort of, this is how I experienced it through pop culture as well. And so, because we definitely did not cover everything. If we had, we would be at this forever. But I think that there's just so much beauty within creativity and artistry that invites us into a new narrative, instead of something that we need to be able to leave behind.
Thank you so much, Sara. This has been the Ascends at Boston Avenue podcast. Our producer is Alicia Urban. Our theme music was composed and performed by Wyatt Smith. Boston Avenue UMC is a progressive historic church located in downtown Tulsa, Oklahoma. Please check out our social media for more information on what's going on at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church. We can be found on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. We'll talk to you next time. Thank you.